Welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the world since 1492, right? We're basically talking about in this unit what's going to happen in Western civilization's history after Columbus makes contact with the Americas, even though he's a garbage person, and we'll talk about that in this flip, actually, and stuff like that. And we're also going to talk about what's going to be going on in the Asian sphere as well, right? What's going on in India since the Portuguese under Vasco da Gama, which some of you are probably like, oh, but Mr. Terry, the world since 1492 is a terrible name for this unit because Vasco da Gama's voyage will happen in 1497. You know what, you little YouTube trolls? Get out of my comments. All right, so now look, the biggest thing about it, though, that you have to understand is that I get that, but like saying since 1492 kind of sets us up in the direction of like it being a pivotal year, okay? So the 1490s, right? Could be actually called Unit 6, the world since the, or like the Western Civ since the 1490s, right? So going into it, though, we left off in class talking about how Portugal's over here, Spain is over here, and how we basically now have this big line that divides the world, and it's called the line of demarcation, drawn by the Pope Alexander VI, and that's going to be done in 1494. But the big thing about it, though, that's going to end up going down is we have two spheres in general of trade and trade empires that are going to be going and growing as time goes on, and then by the 1700s, we're going to have global markets, y'all. But looking at this whole thing, though, we started focusing on the Asian sphere first, right? We started talking about India and the Portuguese involvement there, and we started talking about how nothing stays sacred for long and how some other Europeans are going to want to get involved, right? And those Europeans that are going to want to get involved first are the people known as the Dutch, right? And we talked a little bit, too, about who the Dutch are, right? We talked about who the Dutch are, the people from the Netherlands, right? And we also talked about their ultimate goal, and their biggest goal is to make as much money as possible, right? They see the fact that the Portuguese are making so much money in the Indian Ocean that some people are starting to call it the Portuguese Lake, and they see all these spices coming in, seeing the amount of money that's going to the Portuguese crown and eventually the Spanish crown when the Portuguese actually get taken over by the Spanish, right? So the thing that we need to understand, though, is that it's going to attract a lot of attention, right? And the Dutch are going to show up, and the Dutch, of course, those fun little wooden shoe-wearing people from the Netherlands, are going to show up after being recently liberated from Spain, and they actually fought this thing called the 80 Years' War that actually liberated themselves from Spain and created themselves as their own republic. And what they're going to decide to do is they want to actually set up their own trade industry that's going to go to India and take advantage of that spice trade. But they're heading for the East Indies, though, y'all. We need to understand that. Now, step one to their entire plan was to set up a strategic location and a colony in a place called Cape Town, South Africa, right? It was going to be located right there, and they're going to set up that colony in Cape Town, South Africa, which is why, to this day, South Africa has quite a bit of Dutch influence, so they can get from the Netherlands all the way around Africa, past Cape Town, all the way to India and the East Indies, and then all the way back again, all right? And now that they can get all the way back to the Netherlands, they can actually set up that trade empire that they are desperately trying to actually set up, right? The thing that we need to understand about this, though, as well, not only are they going to set up this colony, the other thing that they're going to set up as well is this new invention of economics, right? They are going to reinvent the economic game in and of itself, right? They're going to reinvent economics, and they're going to create this new thing known as a joint stock company, right? So the thing that we talked about in class a little bit is how the Portuguese were like severely limited in their resources because they were being directly financed by their crown, right? They were being directly financed by the royals of Portugal, right? Starting off with this guy actually called Prince Henry the Navigator in the 1460s. Now, getting into it that you need to understand, though, is the Dutch are going to be like, we don't want to be limited by a government and its taxes and things like that. We want to grow our influence as much as possible and make as much money, so they start this thing called a joint stock company. And the name of that joint stock company is called the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, or in English, under their brand name, they were known as the Dutch East India Company, right? Every one of you needs this symbol in your notes, by the way. If you don't have the symbol in your notes, you're not going to understand this very well, and you're not going to begin to understand what a joint stock company is and why it's so important, okay? So what the Dutch start is this thing called a joint stock company, right? The joint stock company operates kind of like this, right? It's kind of like these sticky notes here, for example. Like if I'm a sailor and I have one sticky note, or if I'm a merchant and I own one boat, right? This one boat is a little bit of a risk for me, because if I send this boat all the way around Cape Town, South Africa, and get it all the way to India, and I bring back a boatload of spices, it's going to make me a lot of money. That's really exciting. I like that for myself. The problem is, though, herein lies the fact that if this boat like sinks and goes away, I just lost all of my money as well. So to protect the investors, what happens instead is they create this thing called a joint stock company, where instead of just me having my boat, I'm going to have that one, and then I'm going to combine that boat with Blythe's boat, and then I'm going to combine it with Bella Green's boat, and then I'm going to combine it with Riley, like Landash, who's got two boats, right? We're going to keep putting this whole thing together, and now we each own shares in this company. So we're pooling all of our finances and our resources together, creating what's known as a joint stock company. And the interesting thing about this entire concept is then we offer it up to y'all and we like, oh, do y'all want to buy shares in this company? Which actually leads directly to the creation of the stock market, right? And we call our company the East India Company, right? So like now going into it though, this creates the stock market and actually leads to the growth and expansion of international capitalism, okay? So the thing about it is that this birth of international capitalism and this concept of a joint stock company is going to make the Dutch and the Dutch East India Company more money than you ever understand. And we talked about this in E period a little bit too today, and we also had a great class in C period today where we talked about it, and we had a great class in B period as well when we talked about this. We talked about how literally if you're looking at a graph of the companies in history that have made the most money, one of the biggest companies that y'all know of very well is none other than Apple, who of course makes our iPhones and stuff like that. Not our iPhones. Some people don't have iPhones, but you know what I'm saying. Who makes the computer that actually Mr. Terry records all of his flips on, and he's been doing it for almost a decade on this one computer, right? Now, Apple, though, is not even worth $1 trillion. Lame, right? Whereas the Dutch East India Company was worth over $7 trillion. Y'all. They are the most, we believe, the historic community believes that the Dutch East India Company is now the most money-making company that the world has ever seen, right? They were literally worth as much as all of these 20 modern-day companies combined, right? In 1637, the market value of the Dutch East India Company was around $7.9 trillion. To get to that level of economics of how much money they were making, you'd have to combine Microsoft, Amazon, like Alibaba.com, ExxonMobil, Bank of America, Walmart, Visa, Chevron, McDonald's. Like, look at some of these different companies, and we look at them as being some of the wealthiest companies in the world. But you'd have to combine all of them together to equal the same market value of the Dutch East India Company. That's bananas, right? And the thing about it is this joint stock principle is a big reason why they're making so much money, right? So the rise of the companies is going to be very, very important. And also, just like we said, nothing stays sacred for long, they're not going to be the only country that does this, right? Some other countries are going to do this as well because they are going to want to get involved and they're going to create joint stock companies and they want to also get to India and get in on that Portuguese spice trade just like the Dutch do as well, right? The British East India Company was also formed as well, but some of you are like, but wait a minute, Mr. Terry, I thought you said the Dutch came up with this idea, and it says that the British East India Company was started in 1600, but the Dutch East India Company was started in 1602. The Dutch started it 2 years later, so it ended like blah, 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 blah. You have to understand that the British East India Company is going to struggle for several decades early on before actually finally finding its footing and then also making just as much money as the Dutch a little bit later on, right? Now, the thing that, also, I don't even know if they ever made as much money. I'll have to look that up. I don't know if they made as much money as the Dutch East India Company. I could be wrong, but they're going to actually start competing with the Dutch in the actual trade market. The British East India Company, though, is actually going to be created in England in 1600 and chartered very specially by that lady right there. None other than Queen Elizabeth, right? Queen Elizabeth is going to be the one that grants the royal charters to the British East India Company, and this is their logo, right? That is their brand name, that if you saw that thing seared onto a box or a cask of wine or something like that, you knew that the Dutch or the British East India Company actually brought all that stuff over. So the thing about it, though, that's going to end up happening is this is going to struggle a bit at first, but it's going to then later on be granted monopolies by the crown, right? Now, some of y'all only know Monopoly as this guy, right? Y'all know Monopoly as the game, but the thing that you need to understand is what a monopoly is when you have cornered the competition in a market, right? So the only people that you could buy Indian spices from, that you could buy tea from, cotton from, tobacco from, timber from the colonies of North America from, it all boils down to one company. It was called the British East India Company, right? The British were the only ones that were allowed to sell these goods to other British people, and the monopoly was granted to them by Elizabeth herself, right? And as you can see right here, we got two different colored lines. We got the orange lines right there, and then we have the pink lines right there. And as you can see, both the British and the Dutch are going to have a mad dash for India to get there as fast as they possibly can to try and make as much money off of all these different luxury items that are over there as much as they possibly can. And the monopolies granted to the British are actually going to make them very, very wealthy and also lead to some things like the American Revolution a little bit later on. When they try to tell the American colonists you can only buy British tea, you can't buy Dutch tea, right? Now this money, speaking of, is going to help lead to war a little bit later on, and this competition over these goods and over these international markets is going to lead to some struggle between some different countries. But we're going to talk about that a little bit later, right? More on all that stuff a little bit later on, but let's go ahead and start talking about what's going on in the Americas now, not necessarily in Asia and in the Indian spice market, but let's talk about what's going on in the Americas once Columbus has actually made contact with North and South America, right? We need to avoid certain terminology terminology like Columbus discovered America, or that he is like the explorer or whatever, because people knew it was there already, right? The Native Americans and the American civilizations that actually lived there include the Mayas, the Aztecs, the Incas, and also the Taino people that he comes into contact with are also going to know it's there already. So where we left off the last, where we were talking about Columbus, is in 1492, in August of 1492. He lands in the Caribbean, in the modern-day chain of islands known as the Bahamas, right? So now the big thing about it, though, is when he lands in the Caribbean, in the Bahamas, he begins to come in contact with the natives there, right? There are natives that live there as well. Just like in North America, you had the Iroquois, the Cherokee, the Sioux, right? Like, so you had the Apache, the Navajo, all these different tribes of individuals and semi-nomadic peoples that lived in North America. You also had tribes of individuals that lived in the Caribbean, Central and South America as well. And the ones that lived in the Caribbean are actually pictured right here talking to Columbus, are these people known as the Taino people, right? The Taino people greeted Columbus also with open arms. If we actually look at that picture right there, you can actually see that they arrived on the beaches with goods, things, and items ready to trade them with these people from a new land, right? Like sailing on these ships the size of, like, larger than their homes, and also carrying weapons and armor and things made of steel, which is something that they had never seen before, right? And apparently, according to Columbus, he said that they showed up naked as the day they were born, offering gifts and luxury items to him and his explorers, right? Now, the relationship, not explorers, but him and the new people showing up from Spain, right? The relationships, though, soon go downhill, and one particular reason why, right? It has to do with religion, right? Because as we can see in this etching and in this photograph, or not photograph, but this engraving, it was actually made like a little bit later on in the late 1500s, early 1600s, we can see something very ominous in the background, and it's the raising of this cross, right? So a big thing that's going to happen is once the conquistadors begin to arrive, we'll talk about what a conquistador is in about 2 seconds. Once they show up, is they start to try and convert the natives that are located in North and South America to Christianity. Specifically, Catholic Christianity is what they try to convert them to, and this is a very common theme, okay? Now, the thing about it, though, that's going on as this is progressing is you have to understand is it's not going to go very well, right? Because the Taino have a sophisticated religious structure and a hierarchy, and they even had social classes within their community. They weren't these people that just, like, didn't know what was going on. They made art, they made jewelry, they made things. They had, like, created a society of unto themselves that had a religion already. So the Taino people are not going to be like, yes, Jesus, right? Like, so, like, literally what ends up going down, though, is they actually early on refuse Christianity, which leads to violence and a lot of, like, lashing out from Columbus and these early, like, the early Spanish warriors that he brought with him and traders that he brought with him. Now, the thing about it, though, is as well as we know another famous story also, that Columbus, whilst he was there, noticed that we have a group of natives that he believed he was superior to, right, as a European, which is disgusting, and you should never think you're superior to another person, right? So the thing about it, though, is the relationship goes downhill because he tries to convert them. They refuse. And another big reason why the relation goes downhill as well is because he wants money, right? Remember that 90-10% contract that he made with Isabella and Ferdinand is going to be a massive motivator for Columbus to try and make as much money as he possibly can. And the big thing about it is he apparently spotted jewelry on the Taino people, and some of it was made out of gold. Now, some of you are looking at this piece of jewelry and you're like, that's made of stone. That right there is one of the only pieces of Taino jewelry that we have left that is actually of archaeological use, because all the gold jewelry was taken by the conquistadors and by the Spanish, military officers and traders that actually showed up, right? Now, Columbus and his colonists, though, are going to use violence to force the Taino to not only give up the gold that they already have, but also to go and retrieve more of it, right? They actually threaten them with different acts of violence that are very aggressive. For example, there was one instance where apparently, like, Columbus's, different colonists, would give a bell, like a ding, 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 like a bell, but they would turn it over. It's called a hawk's bell, right? And we'd give them to them and say, hey, you got 3 months to fill that thing with gold, and if you do not do so, they would cut their hands off, right? And also, not only limited to that, but Columbus even brought some of the Taino people back to Isabella and Ferdinand and gave them away as gifts of slavery, right? Literally gave several Taino people to the king and queen of Spain as a gift, saying that, oh, here's a present of something I found, and gave them human beings, right? Which is disgusting. And also Columbus, though, later on is going to end up doing a lot of dumb stuff, and he can't regulate the colonists that he lives there, and he ends up getting arrested later on. And all of the possessions pass to the Spanish crown, because on his 4th voyage, he could not regulate the colonists that he brought with him, and he actually executed one of them without proper trial. The colonists then revolted against him, and he ends up arrested, and he ends up back in Spain. He actually died thinking that China was right around the corner, and he died in kind of a really impoverished state. But also, that little hawksbill thing with cutting off people's hands that didn't find enough gold is one instance of the violent acts that were reported by the Spanish of the actual Spanish colonists onto the actual natives themselves. There's accounts of them throwing them into pits with dogs. There are accounts of them literally killing their young and offspring, of taking their women, and of course one of the worst ones of literally hanging them over fires and then burning their bodies to death, right? So the thing about it that's really, really crazy is apparently over 95% of the original Taino people of the Caribbean are now gone because they died due to several different reasons, including violence by Spanish colonists, right? Now, going into it, though, as well, Columbus is the first wave of this people known as the conquistadors, which we'll refer to the Spanish by as pretty much this ubiquitous term going forward for the rest of this flip, and then also going forward for the rest of this unit, right? Columbus as a conquistador is very, very important because he's the it's a word that encompasses the idea of a Spanish conqueror, right? The people that are showing up to take the land and take the resources that they are finding in North and South America in these newly seen continents, right? The natives, though, which is really weird, which some of y'all are probably thinking to yourself, you're like, yeah, but I feel like Columbus and 3 boats worth of guys, it could easily be overwhelmed and attacked by hundreds of thousands of natives that live in some of these areas. Like, for example, one of the capital cities of the Aztec had over 1 million people in it, right? So, they've got to be able to fight these people off. You're right, the natives do outnumber the Spanish by a heavy margin. But the thing about it is that the Spanish have 2 things that natives in America never had access to, right? The things that they had were, 1, large domesticated animals like horses, cows, bovine, swine, like chickens and other things like that. Domesticated animals that they would oftentimes domesticate for food, right? And that's going to have a specific impact here in about 2 seconds. And the other thing that the natives of these different areas didn't have was forgeable metals. By the time that the conquistadors actually showed up in Mexico, when they actually began to interact with the Aztecs had just began learning how to smelt bronze, right? So the thing about it is they were a little bit behind the time when it came to things like metallurgy, right? So going into it, though, those forgeable metals made weapons for the Spanish conquistadors, like guns, cannons, swords, iron weapons, armor, things like this, which is a very, very common image of a conquistador, the curved Spanish helmet, right? That thing right there is made of metal and forgeable metal. They had weapons like cannons that natives could not stand up against and or resist, so it's going to lead to the death and destruction of many people in these native communities, right? Now, not only that, though, but a small fraction of the natives that died due to Spanish conquistadors actually being involved in the conquest of these areas is going to be at the hands of violence from the Spanish. But one of the biggest killers that killed over 90% of the people that died due to this entire interaction between the conquistadors and the natives has to do with disease, right? Now, these diseases actually came from the fact that the Spanish had interaction with large domesticated animals, because most of these diseases are actually originally animal diseases that have then jumped or mutated over time into ones that can pass to human beings, right? So the thing about it is that the Europeans carried things like smallpox, influenza, and the measles, which the natives had no resistance against. And it would end up killing somewhere in the ballpark of 90% of the natives that would actually come into contact with the Europeans. But yeah, this is actually a really, really, really dangerous thing that is going to lead to the death and destruction of entire native communities. Now, what we're going to talk about in class, though, is we're going to begin our discussion about the Americas, right? Because this guy named Cortez is going to begin actually trying to take over a place known as Tenochtitlan in the kingdom of the Aztecs, right? Because the Spanish were told by large numbers of people that there was a massive amount of gold in what is now modern-day Mexico, right? And Hernan Cortez landed in what is now modern-day Mexico in 1519 with the intent of conquering all and claiming the gold within that area. But we're going to talk about that in class when I see y'all tomorrow, all right? Y'all have a good one.